Ellen and Tom had lived in Asheville, North Carolina, for over 20 years. They had weathered many storms, so when they heard the news about Hurricane Helene, they were concerned but not panicked. After all, Asheville had rarely seen the full force of hurricanes before, and their house was perched high in the mountains. They watched the news, seeing that Helene was strengthening to a Category 4 hurricane, but they thought that by the time it hit the mountains, it would lose its power. Still, they prepared some supplies and hoped for the best. Hurricane Helene had formed in the Atlantic, initially starting as a tropical depression, but it quickly gained strength as it moved westward. By the time it passed through the Caribbean, it had grown into a Category 4 hurricane, with wind speeds reaching up to 140 miles per hour. Its path was unpredictable, but the meteorologists warned that it would move north, striking the southeastern coast of the United States and possibly reaching inland. By September 27, the storm had already devastated several coastal states, including Georgia, South Carolina, and parts of eastern Tennessee. Asheville, nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, had never seen such a powerful storm before. The mountains usually provided a natural shield, but this time, the rain came down in torrents. The rivers swelled, and soon floodwaters rushed down the streets, turning quiet neighborhoods into raging waterways. Ellen and Tom could hardly believe how fast it happened. By early morning, the rain had picked up, but they still thought they were safe. However, as the day progressed, the winds picked up in intensity, howling through the trees like a banshee's scream. The sound was terrifying, but the worst part was when the floodwaters started rising. Within hours, the river behind their home had swelled beyond its banks, and the water started pouring into their backyard. By late afternoon, the unthinkable happened. The floodwaters surged so violently that it knocked their house from its foundation. Ellen and Tom barely had time to grab a few belongings before they were forced to flee. In the chaos, they lost sight of Cleo, their beloved tabby cat, who had darted under the furniture when the water rushed in. Ellen cried out, desperately searching for Cleo, but the water rose too fast. Before they knew it, their house was swept away with the flood, and Cleo was gone. For hours, Ellen and Tom wandered in shock through the streets of Asheville, which had become a muddy wasteland. Roads were submerged, trees were down, and power was out everywhere. The hurricane had devastated the entire town. They took shelter in a community center along with other displaced families, but Ellen could think of nothing but Cleo. She refused to believe that their cat was lost forever. She clung to the hope that somehow, Cleo had survived. The next day, as the storm finally passed, Ellen and Tom returned to the spot where their house used to stand. The wreckage was almost unrecognizable, but as they combed through the debris, they heard a faint sound. It was a weak, trembling meow. They followed the sound, their hearts racing, and found Cleo trapped under a fallen tree. She was soaked, shivering, and covered in mud, but she was alive. Tears streamed down Ellen's face as she scooped Cleo into her arms, whispering, "You're okay. You're okay." Tom wrapped them both in a blanket, the relief overwhelming. Days after the storm, Ellen, Tom, and Cleo were trapped in a desolate Asheville. The roads leading out of the city were impassable, with landslides and floods blocking every route. Emergency services were overwhelmed, and no one knew when help would come. They were running low on supplies. The power had been out since the hurricane hit, and gas stations were either destroyed or closed due to shortages. Many families, like Ellen and Tom, had spent hours in line only to be turned away when the fuel ran out. Without power, charging phones was impossible, and communication with the outside world was cut off. The silence was eerie, broken only by the occasional distant helicopter bringing relief supplies to the most remote areas. Ellen and Tom rationed what little food they had. Meals were simple: crackers, canned beans, and water they boiled over a small camping stove. They used bottled water sparingly, boiling river water whenever they could. Even that was dangerous, as the flood had swept all kinds of debris into the waterways, making the water murky and foul-smelling. Cleo stayed close to them, never straying far from Ellen's lap. The cat was still weak from the ordeal, and every time Ellen stroked her, she felt her little ribs beneath the fur. They shared tiny bits of food with her, trying to keep her strength up, but Ellen couldn't help but worry. With no refrigeration, they ate the last of their perishables on the second day. By day 3, they were down to 1 can of tuna and a few packs of dried noodles. Food deliveries were supposed to be coming, but the damaged roads made it difficult for trucks to get through. Each morning, they would walk to the main square where rumors of food distribution swirled, but the lines were impossibly long, and supplies ran out before they even reached the front. The nights were cold, with nothing but a few blankets to keep them warm. They took turns staying awake, fearful of looters. The devastation had brought out both the best and worst in people. Some neighbors were kind, offering help and sharing what they could, while others grew desperate, fighting over dwindling resources. At night, Ellen and Tom could hear arguments and the occasional sound of breaking glass as people scavenged for anything useful. As the days dragged on, the psychological toll of their situation became harder to bear. Ellen stared at the sky, waiting for the helicopters, praying that they'd be rescued soon. The isolation was crushing. The worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold, but the uncertainty. How long could they survive like this? On the 6th day, hope came in the form of a small convoy of relief workers who managed to reach their neighborhood. They brought food, bottled water, and blankets. Ellen and Tom stood in line for hours, finally receiving a bag of supplies, rice, canned goods, and a couple of energy bars. It wasn't much, but it felt like a lifeline. That night, as they shared a meal of rice and beans, Ellen looked at Tom. "We're going to make it," she said softly. Tom nodded, squeezing her hand. Cleo purred beside them, a small sign of warmth in the midst of their hardship. They still didn't know when the roads would clear or when power would return, but for the first time in days, they had a small glimmer of hope. They were survivors, and as long as they had each other, they knew they could endure. The road ahead of them was uncertain. Hurricane Helene had devastated not just Asheville but large portions of the southeast. Thousands were displaced, and the recovery would take months, if not years. But at that moment, none of that mattered to Ellen and Tom. They had lost their home, but they had found each other, and their beloved Cleo. That was all they needed to begin again.